For anyone paying attention to this channel, I don't always talk about video games. I've constantly repeated what I like is good storytelling. And good storytelling comes in many forms. It can come in books, films, television series, radio, but it can also come from feelings, from emotions. Good music is good storytelling. It's passing on feeling, a message, a story, a moral, a state of mind. This is where I think video games are excellent as one of the preeminent ways of pulling people into a media series, but the traditional arts still have merit, and one of the current modern day masters of long form storytelling is the author Brandon Sanderson. He's famous for quite a few things, but his big rise to fame came in the years 2006, 7 and 8, where he published a trilogy. 3 books set in the world of Scadrial, a fantasy kingdom, and a fantasy made-up planet. The beginnings of what would later become known as the Cosmere, a series of interconnected works. And across 3 years, he published 3 books telling a pretty amazing story about the reshaping and rewriting of an entire world, an entire planet that's also deeply political and deeply personal to its protagonists. He's done several other big fantasy series since, but in 2011, only less than 5 years after the first trilogy completed, he came back to that world and wrote a whole new Era 2 of Mistborn. And it's taken him 9 years to complete that series because Era 2 was never meant to exist. There were always meant to be multiple eras of the Mistborn series. He'd always said he wanted to come back to that planet and write books set in the future. But when he wrote and published in 2011 The Alloy of Law, it was sort of, inspiration at least, meant to be a one-off, a one-shot novella, medium length, relatively short for Brandon Sanderson standards, novel, just telling some interesting stories. It's just pure happenstance that the characters struck a nerve, that it was really well received, that people wanted to see more of these challenges. And so Brandon Sanderson decided to write a full trilogy, a sequel trilogy to that short story. I say short story, it's actually fairly long in length, but short compared to the other Mistborn novels. And so Era 2 would end up being 4 core books. Like Era 1, there's some smaller or spin-off stories, but the core series is 4 books. And in November 2022, a full 9 years after The Alloy of Law, we have the conclusion of this era. And I'd like to review The Lost Metal, the 4th book in the series, in a completely spoiler-free fashion, so don't worry if you've not read the book yet. I'm not going to give too much away, but I want to see what it says to us about the full Era 2, because anyone paying attention to this channel will know that actually the first Mistborn trilogy was one of the first videos I ever uploaded to YouTube. I deeply love these books, and cut to the conclusion, really glad that The Lost Metal delivers, because before reading it I was really worried about these books. To summarise, I really liked The Alloy of Law, but I really liked it sort of in the sensation of it felt like a spin-off, it felt like a side story. It was good. The main characters, Waxilium Ladrium, Wayne, Marasi and Steris, are fantastic creations. They're really interesting characters, and it's a good story being told across all 4 of these books. All 4 of them go through really solid character arcs. All 4 of them have deep emotional pulls to them. It takes maybe 2.5 books for you to really get to know Steris. She's introduced as quite cold, quite distant, quite calculating, but eventually you find out she's actually really earnest, and once you pierce that barrier and discover who she really is beneath that slightly colder exterior, she's a delightful character. There's good, emotional, real-world reasons about Steris being the way she is. Anyone who knows someone who's got OCD or compulsive or other mental conditions that mean they think in a certain way might recognise some of the things that Steris exhibits and go through. There's particularly what felt to me odd scene in the 3rd book where Steris is actually writing a list of all the ways she's useless. And although, I've gone through mental hardships in the past, that felt really painful to me, but I've spoken to other people who say no, that felt right, that felt appropriate. They're all thoughts that people have. To actually go through and write them down felt painful, and that's Steris in a nutshell. She's anxious, she's scared, and so she puts on, and when you meet her in the 1st book, this horrible persona, someone who just assumes that she's unlikable, and so she might as well play along, because what's the point of pretending she's a likable person if you were then going to discover after the fact that actually no, she was always pointless. So Steris' journey of discovery across the 4 books, of you actually, the reader and the other characters, penetrating that barrier she's erected around herself, is the shallowest of the 4 character arcs. The Alley of Law really focuses on Wax, Wayne and Marasi. Wax as this gunslinging lawkeeper, the hero of legend. His arc, and I'll come to specifically what we go through on Shadows of Self, it's really fun, but it's also really disheartening. Wayne, on the other hand, wisecracking. Wayne makes me wonder if a lot of people have issues with Brandon Sanderson's writing because he has a habit of making his characters constantly cracking witticisms at each other. They're very piffy. And Wayne feels to me like the amalgamation of everything, of all the other piffy comments that the Cosmere characters have been saying over the years, and actually creating one person to be the embodiment of it. Wayne doesn't care about anyone but himself, which is actually not true because he cares about everyone but himself. And it's very weird to see how those two completely opposite character personalities can be completely misinterpreted. And Marasi is a young professional woman with big dreams and ambitions about how she's going to change the world, how she's going to become a respected professional. She goes out and gets a job, and is it everything she'd hoped for? Can she actually live up to her dreams and ambitions? And for her, meeting Wax and Wayne is a bit like meeting your childhood heroes. Are they bound to disappoint her by not living up to the legends? Well, yes, but also she finds out that the legends are far more interesting than she'd been led to believe. The truth is almost stranger than fiction. So that's the character arcs. Those are the main characters. The Alley of Law, though, as I said, it feels like a side. Now, what it sets up is really interesting, but it's almost doing its own thing. It feels like a snapshot into another world that you never really meant to see any more of it. It's a really enjoyable book, but it comes to a natural ending, and it feels like the things it's setting up are very long-term in terms of the payoff. That's how it was written. Brandon Sanderson then wrote the next 2 books, Shadows of Self and the Bands of Mourning, almost together, although actually he started Shadows of Self and found it one of the most difficult books he's ever had to write. And so he paused it, wrote the Bands of Mourning, the 3rd book in the series, and then came back to rewrite to finish Shadows of Self. Knowing that, how the series eventually turns out makes a lot of sense to me. I adored Shadows of Self. It's a deeply personal, introspective book. It's about trauma. The Alley of Law was a lot of fun. Although there was deep, character themes, it was just a rollicking good adventure. And Shadows of Self has some of that, but it's also about trauma. It's about your relationship with your god. And remember, this is set in a fantasy world where there is a definitive god. We've seen the birth of that god in the first series, and this is a world that's been manufactured, created, and it's not a paradise. And can you blame God for it not being a paradise? So there's a lot to pick apart in this series. Some people really don't like Shadows of Self because it slows down so much, because it's so intrusive. The trauma is so intrusive on the story. I personally felt the revelations, the betrayal at the end of it, are really good emotional read. Whereas I, on the other hand, really then bounced off the Bands of Mourning. Anyone reading the Mistborn series, you should read up to this point before you read Mistborn Secret Histories, which is a spin-off book from the original series. It doesn't really matter if you read them out of order. That, as I said, spin-off book that was released in 2016, I read it first. I knew something about a side story about something big that had happened in the original series, and it completely, for me, undermined the big twist, the big revelation, the big story, the secret, the mystery that the Bands of Mourning was leading towards. It had no big surprises. What the Bands of Mourning is it's a bit closer to Alley of Law in terms of the pace of the novel. It's constantly moving forwards. The characters are going new places, discovering new things, meeting new characters, making new technological discoveries. And the pace of it means none of those ideas really get a chance to be explored properly, at least not to my taste. It moved too quickly, it left too many holes open, and the big revelations were not satisfying enough because for me they'd already been spoiled. So that's my perspective though. I know a lot of other people who feel completely the opposite way. They really didn't like how the Shadows of Self slowed the series down. They much preferred the Indiana Jones Boy's Own Adventure feel of the Bands of Mourning. And then nearly 5 years later, or over 5 years later, we get to the 4th book in the series, The Lost Metal. And I'm pleased to report, spoiling anything the book contains, it's a good compromise. It's got strong character arcs of these 4 characters to complete. It's got to tie up their adventures because presumably we won't be seeing Wax, Wayne, Marasi or Steris again. We're going to move on from this era. Never to, Brandon Sanderson move on and write books set in a very different world, a very different time. So he had a lot to tie up here. And I think he did so in a very satisfying way, finding a balance between those 2 extremes from the middle 2 books. The other thing to say about The Lost Metal is it really ties into some stuff elsewhere in the Cosmere. It pulls on friends. They're not a large part of the book, but it pulls on things from novels like Elantris and the Emperor's Soul, from some stuff we've seen in the Stormlight Archive series or hinted at elsewhere. You wouldn't miss anything if you've not read any of them reading Lost Metal, but they are quite nice hints of more going on in this universe than if you've restricted yourself purely to the Mistborn books than you would have seen before. What I would say is if you have read the original Mistborn trilogy and you're considering picking up Era 2, don't dive straight from Hero of Ages to the Alley of Lore. I would strongly recommend putting something else between the two Mistborn eras to give you a little bit of break, to try and imagine and let time pass. You don't want to completely forget the story of Vin, Kelsier and Sazed and Marsh, and the other incredible characters from the first series. But at this point in Era 2, they're meant to be characters from mythology. You're not really meant to remember exactly who they are and what they wanted, because this is set 300 years later. These whole new characters that are the core of the story, that are 99% of the story, should be your focus. And although it's fun to know a little bit about Kelsier, we know more than any of the characters in these books do. I actually think it would be to your detriment to fly straight from the Heroes of Ages to Alley of Lore, because if you knew all the details of what really happened, personally I think it diminishes the new stuff, the exciting stuff, and the horrific tale of what almost happened to him before the book started. He starts as a broken man in the Alley of Lore. He is broken once again in Shadows of Self, and then the Bands of Mourning and the Lost Metal are recovery of him finding his place in the world again, the broken lawman coming to terms with who he is and what he is and his role in the world. Finding your role in the world, where literally you have a telephone to God, is quite an interesting and difficult concept, and I'm very pleased with the way that Brandon Sanderson worked this in. I think if Era 1 didn't exist, this would feel a lot more awkward. But the fact that we know Sazed better than these characters does a lot to tie it together. Anyway, that's my thoughts on Lost Metal. Its positioning and the awkward way it ties up this series of 4 books. All of them are distinct, none of them are repetitive. It's a fairly well-balanced series in retrospect. I think if you'd asked me in 2017, I was worried that the 3 books we'd had so far were all too divergently different. They were all pulling in different directions. I'm quite happy in the way this one pulls everything together. I have one overall comment, which is the overall villains of Era 2. They don't really have any depth to them in the way I wanted. And what you learn about them in each book, I kept expecting to find out more. You find out more about what they're doing. You find out more about their methods. You find more about what they're up to. But you don't really find more about them and their belief. These really are paper-thin villains. And that's a shame. That's my one criticism. And it's something that Brandon Sanderson has historically done really well at. Ruin, in The Hero of Ages, was a fantastic villain. The Lord Ruler, okay. He was mainly about intimidation and front, but that was the character. This was an undefeatable villain. That was his character. And when you found out more against him, it just gave you so much more empathy for these characters after the fact. I walk away from Era 2 with no empathy for the villains. No empathy for what their motives were. I understand that by the end, they were in a tough place. I'm not completely clear on whether their motives at the end of book 4 were the same as their motives going into book 1. Did something happen between books 1, 2 and 3 that put them into the position that the villains ended up in book 4? I'm less clear on that. I hope in future eras of the Mistborn series we get slightly more defined antagonists. And it's something that Brandon Sanderson has been historically better at. But here his heroes are on point. Wax and Wayne, and to a lesser extent Marasi and Steris, will go down in the Cosmo histories as some of the best protagonists we've had. It's just been a really wild and exciting ride. So I'd heartily recommend Era 2. I'd heartily recommend The Lost Metal and the 3 books preceding it. And if you've enjoyed this series, please let me know your thoughts. If you've read them, don't put too many spoilers in the comments for this YouTube video. Please give people a chance to read and enjoy it for themselves, because as Kelsier has often commented, there's always another secret.